up to meet with Leopold Brothers today. Just waiting for them to jump on the call. Thanks for joining our live broadcast. Talking, hey, there we go.
Hello.
Uh,
Hi, Greg. Good. Just unloaded 50,000 pounds of Abruzzi rye and 60,000 pounds of Colorado peaches. It's been a busy day.
the butcher ride is what I want to hear about, actually. Can you talk to us a little bit? First of all, can you introduce so everyone knows who you are?
Happy to. I'm Todd Leopold, the distiller at Leopold Brothers Distillery and Malt House out of Denver, Colorado. We're coming up on our 25th anniversary here, so we're kind of the old new guard or new old guard, I guess, depending on how you want to look at us. The Abruzzi rye, this is a variety of rye that was championed by distillers, particularly in Maryland, that I came across in all sorts of agricultural publications from the late 1800s. It came over from Rome. And it kind of cut to the chase. The reason the distillers loved it so much, it has very high levels of two things. One, linalool, which is basically floral notes, lavender, which is a key part to what I would call traditional American rye. And the other is a compound called ferulic acid. Let's start out and go full nerd, right?
Well, I know that you're a malting major in college, right? You're a classically trained malter, right?
Yes, I am out of a brewing school in Germany.
Yeah.
And ferulic acid is the building block for a compound called 4-vinyl guaiacol. And if you've ever had German wheat beer, it's that spicy note. What a lot of distillation fans and whiskey fans may not know is that all the major yeast strains used in the UK and in America are all Hefeweizen strains. So in other words, if you feed the yeast ferulic acid, you're going to create this spicy compound. But if you don't use that yeast, you're not going to create it. So if you use a typical ale yeast like you'd use for a pale ale or something like that, you won't get that big spicy note. And there's ways to control it. So one of them is variety, which is why I like the Abruzzi rye so much. The other are mashing temperatures that you can kind of play around with to either put your foot on the accelerator or ease off.
Yeah.
And then of course there's your grist recipe, right? So how much of it are you going to add? And the more and more research I did, particularly in the Maryland distilleries, I came across an article. And not an article, an op-ed that was penned by a very angry Maryland distiller during Prohibition, or right after it, who was upset at what he saw as the dilution of Maryland rye. And so he kind of laid out what Maryland rye was, and he said everybody had three things in common. Everybody had little differences, but the three things in common. One was an entry proof of 50% into the barrel.
Yeah.
Right. The other was use a 3-chamber still. Yeah. And then the last was that it was all rye. So in other words, either 100% raw rye, 100% malted rye, or some combination therein. So that's his opinion, obviously. That doesn't mean that there weren't other distilleries.
There's no official designation that says that was his.
Yeah. So it wasn't a hard and fast rule. But, you can kind of think of him, if there are any beer fans on, as somebody protecting real ale or protecting the German purity law. Or that's kind of how I viewed it. And, Abruzzi rye was very prized by the distillers. The irony is, then the American whiskey history is replete with them. They were getting this rye from the rye growing areas, so up further north. He was name checking Michigan in particular for getting rye in the Dakotas, of course, and then we know Canada is basically, the haven for rye production. But I got a hold of the Abruzzi seeds from an FDA seed bank over a decade ago, and now we're doing several hundred acres of it, and it just makes all the difference.
You grow your own rye. I know you sort.
No. I am not a farmer. I'm not taking credit for that work. No. We have a malt house.
Okay.
We do that part of the process, but yeah, farming is a whole nother
Yeah, no, I didn't think so. The
kudos for the
I
farmers.
do want to talk. So you've got this the ingredients that you've taken so much time to cultivate. I also want to hear about the floor malting process. So went through a deep rabbit hole, watching some of the videos of your team doing floor malting. I feel like I would love for you to talk a little bit about that process and how that differentiates what you guys are doing.
Well, it's just I'm lucky enough to have my diplomas in malting and brewing. Um, this isn't even offered in these brewing schools anymore, and it's a vestige from when brewers, if you made beer, you had to know how to make malt because it was very common to have your own maltings because of course it was, you're a brewer. Industrialization came along. The big thing that people have to remember in America is what a massive effect. I guess it sounds kind of dumb to say it out loud, but prohibition broke so many traditions and so much agriculture because it wasn't just barley being grown everywhere. It was everything from juniper to hops to at one point, speaking on the staying on the floor malting side of things, the barley that was grown in the Sacramento Valley in California was so highly prized that the Scots were using it to make whiskey in the late 1800s, which of course immediately, sets now you're starting to think like a sailor going, how the hell, what's the fastest route to Scotland? How does that make any sense
The
at all?
logistics of the late 1800s whiskey production is
Yeah,
mind-boggling.
really, it's crazy. And it had a lot to do with them going off of the silver standard. So the currency exchange, and taxation always plays a role.
Right.
So that, they tax malt. Irish famously tax the stills, which is why the stills wound up being so enormous.
Yeah.
Everybody's trying to figure out a way around the taxes.
I wrote a college thesis paper about the Irish taxi of the stills
Oh my goodness,
from
that.
a
Oh,
history paper.
well, the minute we get off of this, I'd love it if you would forward that to me.
Oh, for a while. I
I,
still have it.
Yeah, find that in a dusty old box and send
Yeah.
it along. But the floor malting process, it's just it gives us levers of quality that nobody else has access to. And if you can think about, I was lucky enough to work at Springbank, for just a couple days. I'm not sure if work is the appropriate word. Although I did grab a shovel, I don't know how much help I was. But anyways, the way that the distillers are making their malt in the UK, up and unaware of anybody doing anything other than making pale malt, right? So in other words, they're malting for the enzymes, they're malting for self conversion, and they're kilning it at about 190 degrees, and they're not making any kind of specialty malts, which from my perspective of starting as a German trained brewer is a bit weird,
Yeah.
in the sense that there's a whole array of malts that you can make where, if you've ever had an Oktoberfest beer and it has this nutty flavor to it, well, that nuttiness will come through into the distillate. So to me, when we're using our malt, and we haven't released any of our malt whiskey, we're 10 years away from doing that. Um, we're doing single varieties and malting them in different ways with the idea that we can blend and combine them later, kind of the way the Canadians do it
Yeah.
with corn, with rye, where they're fermenting and distilling them separately, aging them separately, and then blending them together later, which I think is a very, very cool way to make whiskey. The floor malting process, because I'm making it just for distillation, all the rules are gone. So in other words, if I'm malting for a brewer, I have to worry about shelf stability, right? I have to worry about filterability in a louder ton, which
Where you have to have a much wider shot of use cases. Yeah.
exactly right. So I don't have to worry about any of that stuff because we're hammer milling, we're fermenting on grain, and then distilling it in a chamber still. So I don't have to worry about that. So the way my head maltster likes to put it, we're chasing flavor. So we're applying these malting techniques in a way that have never been applied before to whiskey because we're lucky enough to have this tool in our toolbox. and it's why I got into this 30 years ago. I want to make things, and I want to make things that are unique and different, and do our level best as a team to take American distilling into directions that it hasn't been in. So, for example, we're applying Munich malt techniques to corn. Right? Nobody malts corn. It was a very common thing to do back in the day. And the way that Munich malt is made, and it's very hard to explain this without a drawing, but I'll do my level best. You can picture the corn sitting 3 feet deep in a square that's sitting on top of a perforated stainless steel deck. You're going to blow live, or excuse me, you're going to blow warm and then hot air up through this, and then up out the top vent to dry it. Right? It's been germinated. It's sitting at almost 50% moisture. And during the kilning process, you're going to drive it down to 5%. So the way that you make Munich malt that gives it that beautiful, if you've had beers with the reddish color, or again, the Oktoberfest with kind of that orangey reddish color, the way that that's made is the top of the kiln has a vent. You close that vent when you've dried it to about 30% moisture, and then you open a side circulation vent so that the air is circulating within the kiln, and now there's nowhere for the water to go. So you're holding the moisture, right, it's circulating, so it's like a convection oven.
Yeah.
Okay? So, but because it's at 30% moisture and the water isn't being driven out, you can think of each individual seed kernel as a mash tun. Okay, so now that you're mashing, you apply mashing temperatures that are going to form sugars, right? You hold it there for several hours, and after you form those sugars, then you release the top, and then you start hitting it with 190, 220, 230 degree heat, and now you're going to get Maillard reaction. So in other words, you've got sugar, you've got amino acids, you're applying heat. So this is where you're getting baked good notes in it. And in the case of the corn, there are two things that it's driving, which I'm working with some malting scientists to figure out what the hell's going on, because this has never been done before. Nobody's ever made Munich malt with corn in history that I can find.
Yeah.
And many of my malting colleagues are totally unaware of it too. There are two things that are happening. One, when you open up the kiln, when you're done, it smells like peanut shells or hazelnuts. It's driving that nutty character
yeah.
In addition to that, it smells like cinnamon toast crunch, to the point where I had to run and get my head maltster and say, "You've got to come up and smell this." I didn't tell him what I smelled. I'm like, "Am I nuts?" And it smelled like cinnamon toast crunch, or cinnamon toast, or bread, for whatever it is you want to call it. And starting to look into it a little bit more chemically, it turns out that cinnamic acid is in corn, and the amount of cinnamic acid doubled. Now, of course, this is carrying over into the distillate. Now, you can't smell it later. It's because it's warm. Because it's still hot, so you can smell it. But, once you let it cool, now you're not able to nose it. So it's one of the lucky things about being able to malt your own grains. You get to smell it when it's germinating. You get to smell it when it's in the kiln. And these cues and chemicals are going to show up in the distillate downstream in your whiskey. And if you're working, and so, of course, Danny, at the end of the day, he has to hop into the kiln and shovel out, 25,000 pounds of malted corn. Now, what do you think that's going to do to his sense memory when he's tasting the distillate in another 8 to 10 years? He's going to be able to pick up on all of these cues that he's getting. And I'm something about the malting process is leading to more cinnamon. And I can't tell you scientifically why yet, but it's one of those exciting things, to answer your question as to why we do it, is that we're able to coax flavors out, whereas all the other, distillers that aren't as lucky, they're stuck with what they're buying off of the shelf.
Yeah, I love your dedication to it, right? You have a background in it, but also that you've cultivated this team that's into this idea of like, let's explore, let's go where nobody's gone before. And I think at this ingredient level, it's fascinating. Todd, I want to go back a little bit in history, right? You've got this background. but you also got into business with your brother, and alcohol and brothers might not always mix. So can you talk to us a little bit about how did Leopold Brothers get started? How did you guys go from, hey, we should make a whiskey to actually getting off the ground?
Well, well, we started as a
Yeah.
brewery, and the entire reason we started the business, my brother had just gotten his master's from Stanford in environmental engineering, and he was working for the largest environmental engineering firm in the world. It's called Black and Veatch, and what he was doing early in his career, so he's in his 20s. This was 1993, and he was working for Black and Veatch, and his job at the time was to go into Fortune 500 factories. So think like electroplating or paper pulp mills,
Yeah.
or one I'll always remember is Crayola. He went into the Crayola plant, which totally ruined my childhood because, as I like to joke, you kind of picture bunny rabbits, stirring vats of happy crayons, and
Uh,
that's not at all what it was. Um, in my brother's mind, he was going in to show them how to make what we now call, this wasn't a word back then, sustainable, right?
sure.
That wasn't even a thing. And in fact, he got rejected. He saved the letter from the University of Michigan. He was trying to get a joint MBA and an environmental engineering degree. And the letter he got back from whoever the hell the person was that was evaluating his application, we don't see a tie between these two things. This is how the world is. It
Yeah.
takes time for people to reframe their mindset, and that was kind of part of that. But anyways, he was getting frustrated because what wound up happening was, obviously, these plants just wanted to get EPA compliant and get the dumb 20-year-old kid out of their
Yeah.
plant. So he got frustrated. He's like, I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. I want to show people how to make what he called zero waste at the time, as close to zero waste as possible, and show people simple things that are taken for granted now. So, for example, how thin beer cans have gotten, right?
Yeah.
That those things were massive when you and I were well, at least me. When I was a kid, they were thick as all get out. And think about what a lot of the water bottles are like. Not that bottled water makes a lick of sense anyways, but they almost crumple in your hands. That's
Yeah.
less shipping weight. That's less energy. That's right. Outside of the fact that they're carrying water, that's more sustainable than it used to be. Um, so he decided to, at the time I was at the Siebel Institute in Chicago, um, graduated from there, and then we decided to start up our own business. And that's when I left for Germany to go to Domens, which is a brewing school just outside of Munich. And we came back and we opened up a brew pub in Ann Arbor, Michigan, to show people how to make it, reduce water usage, to reduce energy usage, and why that's better business. So in other words, you can hate the environment and not care about it at all. This is a better way to run a factory. You're using, you're more efficiently using your raw materials and making better use of your energy, and using less paper, and using water-based inks, and making sure there's no toluene or gross chemicals in the glue that's going to wind up in our water. Um, you know,
That's the point, right? For any good sustainable initiative or practice, it has to be rooted in what's the business going to get from it, how are they going to benefit from it, and yeah,
Absolutely. And for example, so now we're about, I think, 30,000 square feet of plant now between our barrel house and everything else. We have one household size trash can. That, that's all that we have that doesn't go to either compost a farm or,
that's amazing.
yeah, that's my brother. And of course, the great thing is that you don't notice it. You don't notice because we're not bringing the stuff in that needs to go in the trash
Yeah,
can in the first place. So it's an out of sight, out of mind kind of a thing. So it's very, very clever. And, a typical distillery, and another quick one, real quick on the sustainability side. Distillery, winery, brewery, for every bottle produced, a good plant will be at 4-to-1. So that would be like a New Belgium, or these days Budweiser, Coors. They're very serious about energy
oh yeah, yeah,
efficiency,
yeah.
which is a beautiful thing. People tend to throw rocks at corporations, but they're doing a great job. And so if you can think about, if you go to a smaller distillery, and you ask them, how do you cool your condenser? And if they say city water, what it means is that they've got a 3/4-inch pipe that's wide open as long as that's got up real fast in terms
It's
of.
we're losing you a little.
Oh, we are?
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that. Are we?
No, we were right after we talked about ANS or InBev. We started glitching out a little bit. There we go.
Oh, okay? Well, let's get back into the water just real
Yeah.
quick. So a good rate water to wastewater ratio is 4 to
Okay.
1. So in other words, one bottle of whatever produced, you've got 4 bottles of wastewater. We're at 2 and change if you're just looking at the production facility.
That's incredible.
Yeah, again, that's an easy thing. One last explanation on that: the biggest reason why we use wooden fermenters. So this is a very, very Leopold Brothers way of approaching things because it involves quality, it involves energy efficiency, and it involves financial efficiency. So think about a stainless steel tank. When you empty it, again, brewer, distiller, winery, doesn't matter. You've got your stainless steel service that you need to clean. You need to clean and sanitize it. So you got your hot water rinse, circulate caustic. Caustic gets out the organic materials. Rinse, acid gets out inorganic materials that can hide bacteria. Rinse, sanitize, and then some places have a post rinse. All the labor, all the chemical, all the energy, you pay for the water in, you pay for the water going out. For us, for the wooden fermenters, we drain it out, pump it over into a still. We hit it with one last bit of water to get out the solids, and that water goes into the still, right? Because that's still going to contain some alcohol in it,
Yeah.
and then it's ready to refill. So our wooden fermenters that we had, if we put in stainless steel fermenters, we did the math. These wooden fermenters are free now because they're that old. After eight years, after 8 years, because we don't have to pay for all of what I mentioned,
Yeah.
and we don't have to pay for all the labor that goes into turning that tank around. From a distilling perspective, over time, we're going to get wild yeast and bacteria that's living in the wood that's going to add to the character of the whiskey. And I can tell,
right.
yeah, and I can tell you that works because at our old plant, that we had in Michigan, we didn't have wooden fermenters, but we were still making whiskey. We wound up getting an octyl acetate note, switching over to wood. And octyl acetate tastes like orange marmalade.
Okay.
So in all of the whiskeys that we make, you're going to get this orange note that's present that I can plot out on gas chromatography. And that's what I changed. I changed 2 things. 1, using wooden fermenters, and 2, making our own malt. And the malt is where that bacteria comes from chiefly. And that's what's leading, but it's a simple thing. When you have organic acids that come from these bacteria, from lactic acid bacteria, so lactic acid bacteria produces lactic acid and acetic acid. And over time, you've got your alcohol solution sitting in that barrel. Oxygen will work its way into the barrel, combine with those organic acids to create esters. And so octyl acetate, as the name kind of connotes, or denotes actually, starts with a base of acetic acid. So that orange marmalade is coming from having these open fermenters and making our own malt. So we're getting better quality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before we get into the so for PourMore, again, we're a whiskey of the month club, whiskey, bourbon, scotch. We sent out a bunch of different clubs, and we sent out the Leopold Brothers 8-year cask strength bourbon to one of our clubs this month. So can you talk to me about how that bottle came to be in the process, and what we've been talking about for your fermenters and how that
absolutely. So grist bill on that is 65% corn, 15% rye, 20% floor malt. That 20% floor malt was much more common in the 1800s because in those days you didn't have access to enzymes in a jug, right? Whenever you see 95.5 or some of those other numbers, what they're telling you is that they're adding enzymes to get the conversion over. The reason that distilleries like having less and less malt is malt's expensive. It's about money. That's not to say you can't make world-class whiskey with 95.5. Obviously, you can. I want to make sure I'm clear on that. But the elevated amount of malt that you have in there is going to completely change the character of the whiskey. And so for people who are used to, your Kentucky and Tennessee bourbons, which are world class, and I adore them too, I'm trying to get you something different. I can't compete with Buffalo Trace and the good people at Wild Turkey on price. I just can't.
Yep.
So what am I going to do? I'm going to make things that are different. So when you're looking for something that's a little bit different, it's going to start with that grist bill. So that 20% floor malt is the first thing. The second thing that you're going to notice, you can taste the grain, right? So this is very intentional. To me, when you have so much barrel that you can't tell what it is you've fermented, it's no longer rye whiskey. Or in the case of bourbon, if you can't taste even a hint of corn, that's not bourbon.
Yeah.
The only thing that makes it bourbon is the corn. So if you can't taste it, you kind of have to think, I'm not saying it can't be delicious. It can, of course. But to me, we do all of this work on the malting floor and all the work with these heirloom grain varieties that we have. And I want you to taste that. And so I've learned over the years with especially the last few years as we've actually have bourbon nerds finally, which we did not have in the first 15 years of my career. They call it craft funk. What they mean by craft funk, 99.9% of the time is you can taste that linalool that I mentioned from the rye.
Yeah.
That's almost always what they are talking about. And the modern varieties of rye that are used don't have as much of it. And so when you taste that it's lavender is what it tastes like to me. So when people, say that they don't care for our whiskeys, that's what they're talking about. Well, I'm leaning into that.
Yeah.
That's
what you came for.
Yeah. So if that's not, and they just, kind of dismiss us and assume that I don't know what I'm doing. And like, I'm fairly confident we know what we're doing here. We've been working at this for a long time. If you don't care for it, that's, completely cool, but don't dismiss these things out of hand is my unasked for advice, I guess, on that, because these are the flavors that we had. Basically, we went in one generation, again, going back to Prohibition, we went from distilling and whiskey in America from being an agricultural practice straight into an industrial practice in one generation. And the part that people, I can assure you, do forget, Prohibition ended during the Great Depression. So we went from everybody having a still to nobody being able to afford to have a still.
Yeah.
So the only place that they were getting these whiskeys what was mass produced for the most part, not completely. There still were chamber stills. There was Hannesville, Old Overholt, by the way, had a 3-chamber still. And if you notice with their latest 10-year release, what's their recipe? It's the same as our 3-chamber rye. It's 80-20. That's intentional on their part. They know what those whiskeys were like back then.
The old world style, the old, yeah.
That's right. So for the bourbon, to circle back to that, this is 8 years old, and I finished them in 3-chamber rye cask. One, because I thought it was funny. So, in other words, who the hell finishes a bourbon in a rye cask? Right?
Right.
So I thought that was kind of funny. Maybe that's just my sense of humor. But we put it into the 3-chamber rye cask to pick up that lovely lavender note and the oiliness that you get. It really rounds out the finish and gives it a depth that the bourbon, because it's pot distilled, on its own doesn't have. And I wanted to make something that was unique. And the thing we're proudest of, the price. This is cost competitive. It's on the shelf. I guess it's all over the place these days because liquor stores don't tend to follow MSRP anymore, as it did back in the day. But this is an affordable 8-year-old cask strength rye that's on the same price level as you'll get from the major distillers, which we're very, very proud of. We want people to drink it. The reason that you're getting such a big, or from my palate anyway, such a big contribution from the three-chamber rye barrels, we don't dump our barrels. We decant them. So in other words,
Oh,
our barrels sit in place in dunnage storage. So picture Scottish distilleries where you've got the barrels sitting on top of what look like
yep.
ladders. They only go about 4 high. We do that because we want to get as even a temperature in the whiskeys as I can. It's on earthen floors. The reason I did that, that's stealing from the Scottish, but I'm not doing it for the same reason they do. We're in Denver, and it's August, and we get humidity here that'll be in the single digits. Well, think about what that does to the whiskey. You got your barrel,
Yeah.
you got your permeable membrane, and oh, cool! I just did hearts. There you go.
There
I
you go.
love everybody today. All right. Apparently, hearts is what escapes from barrels. So you got your whiskey sitting underneath that membrane. The amount of water that you have in the air dictates how much is evaporating. And generally speaking, I'm speaking in big generalities here. Generally speaking, when you've got more water in the air, that's going to slow the evaporation of water in it. But it's the evaporation of everything, actually. So if you don't do anything, if you've ever had Garrison Brothers, who I just adore, Garrison Brothers, they just do nothing. Well, what's happening is their evaporation rate, is in the double digits per year.
Yeah.
What we wanted to do was slow that evaporation rate. And as I mentioned, my brother's background, we're not going to do what a lot of distilleries do in the Western states, which is age in a regular old industrial climate controlled warehouse and pump water into the air, misters like you'd see on patios sometimes. Yeah, that's a no-no. So what did we do? We built a building, and if you can think about the building here, we've got native plants that are all around it with drip irrigation with the idea of the moisture coming up into the building and it's getting trapped by the roof. So the building is about 30% more relative humidity almost year round, to slow the angel share so they're nurturing.
Barrier to enrich the soil as well and just make the whole thing a
Got it.
very natural approach. I mean, that's
Yep.
amazing.
So what that does is it got our angel share down to about 4.2% per year, which is on par with what they get in Kentucky. And,
Yeah.
and I actually got a nice handshake from my brother, which I don't get very often. When we started seeing the numbers come back, I was hoping for anything in the single digits, but when it was that low, I was thrilled. The other interesting thing that happens, and I'll answer that question here in a second that I'm seeing it on my screen. Um, the other thing that happens that's unusual, for the very first 5 years, the proof doesn't move. So I mentioned that barrel entry proof in the Maryland Rye op-ed that he wrote. All of our whiskeys are in at 50%. This was the American standard before
Right.
Prohibition. Everyone did it. You named the distillery, they were in at 50%. That changed in 1962. And the reason that they raised the proof is you need fewer barrels and you need fewer buildings. It was a money cost saving metric. Accountants showed up.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
no, and we should all be grateful to these accountants, because if they didn't do this, we may not have an American whiskey industry. So, and obviously, clearly, plainly, you can make world-class whiskey at that higher proof.
Mhm.
I just prefer this lower proof because what I'm doing is I'm giving the customer more. I'm not washing out all the flavors and the aromas that I worked so hard to develop in the barrel. But that's why the bottle that your club has in front of you is only 55%. And finally, when we got to 8 years, the proof finally drifted up to 55. And that's what barrel after barrel keeps coming out at 55, 55.1, which is kind of disappointing in the sense that we want people to understand this is cask strength. And it's like, well, why the hell is this so uniform? And it's one of the great,
But I
yeah,
love the fact that each batch is building on what came before it, right? So it's not
yes.
just one and done. You have this sort of like organically growing story around each successive bottle and barrel and expressions.
That's exactly
Yeah.
it. So when it comes to waste, the used barrels. Well, first of all, obviously we're reusing the three chamber rye barrels for the bourbon, and then when we're done, we've been working with I think, a well-known brewery, New Belgium Brewing.
Mm-hmm.
We've been working with them for
Fire,
15
right?
years. You got it.
Yep.
They've been using our barrels for their sour beer program for 15 years. And when they wind up not needing them in various periods, other brewers pick them up. So our barrels are in very high demand simply because of what I explained. So because we're decanting them, the barrels are still wet. There's going to wind, the cup of barrel char that it's about a cup of the char that flakes off when you turn them upside down that exits the barrel. That's still sitting in there, right? So our barrels are wet. Yeah. So the brewers, whenever they get our barrels for the first time, they open them up, and of course, it's a bunch of brewers, right? So what do? They hold a glass underneath it, usually, and enjoy it themselves, or they let that carry over, fully into the whiskey. But
When you say you decant it, so physically, instead of dumping it into a trough, what are
yeah,
you?
it is a stainless steel rod that you can picture with a spring, a stainless steel spring at the
Okay.
bottom that holds it up off of the very, very bottom of the barrel. And then we just start a simple siphon.
Okay.
That's it. So with that, the reason I like doing that is manifold. I already touched on one reason. You get more flavor out of it if you're putting something else into it. And we put our single malt into it. And, there's various things that we're using these used barrels
Yeah.
for. We haven't released the single malt yet. So, um, but the other reason is I don't have to filter it. I think like a brewer. So the idea of turning the barrels upside down and then filtering the char out makes no sense to me. So I'd much rather decant it. And so everything that we're packaging, again, including the bottle in front of you, it's unfiltered. It's unfiltered, straight out of these two barrels. And to me, it's unlike any other bourbon out there. We're very, very pleased with it, with how it turned out.
We've had great feedback, and I've had a great time today. We've gone really deep into science, which I love. We never get to go this deep into science, so I appreciate all the really deep insight. Would love to know. So, kind of one more question to go. When you're not drinking your own stuff, what are the bourbons you like drinking right now?
Oh, Wild Turkey.
Oh,
That's an easy one. I don't understand why Wild Turkey 101 isn't one of the allocated Cool Kid bottles. I don't get it. I taste it, and not that other whiskeys aren't absolutely fabulous. They are, but to me, what the Russells have done, from what I'm personally looking for, and obviously it comes to your personal taste.
yeah,
It just hits all the notes. They're such legends. They're as good a people as they are distillers. They lead the way for the rest of us little
yeah.
guys. And it's fun to be a really, really small part of American whiskey, because I think it's in a really cool, fun place right now. I think some of the fans, I'm imagining, you might be maybe frustrated about not being able to get some bottles and this and that, but we're in a good place. And if it means anything from my particular vantage point, we're about to hit a glut again. So you're about to see age statements being restored, which is already happening in
Yeah.
Scotland. And you're going to be buying no age statement whiskeys that today are 4 years and 10 minutes that are going to start having 6, 8, 10 as they're not able to sell through it. So I think that American whiskey.
You guys seen a bit of a decline? You seen
Oh, it's January was like you took a record needle off.
oh
Uh, and a lot of it, there are just a million reasons why, but the easiest thing to make this quick so I don't drone on and on, when I was sitting in Zoom calls like this during COVID, I was looking at 30 and 40 of these little squares from all over the world, but mostly in America, and I'm taking pictures from my brother because I'm looking at these back bars that looks like they're sitting in front of Jack Rose, right?
yeah,
And I'm looking at this going, there's no way that this purchasing behavior is going to continue. It's
yeah,
just not possible. And then to top it off, what makes it particularly hard for the smaller distillers is that we've trained the whiskey fans to try something and move on.
Mm. As opposed to
How,
going deep and finding a favorite.
how do you build a small distillery or even a medium-sized distillery when they come in and buy this? Now, for us, we're lucky. We make everything. And so we've never, and this probably sounds strange from the three-chamber guy, or that's kind of how people look at me after 30 years of work. I'm the three-chamber guy. But we make gins, we make cordials, I make absinthe. We do a little bit of everything here. We're not fishing from the bourbon fan pool. We're just not. And we learned that from the same thing happened to breweries. If you're familiar with Untapped, it doesn't matter. It's an app that is training the fans of beer to check it off the list and then move on to the next one. So you go from a captain to a colonel to a whatever. So you're literally telling them, don't have a session beer, don't have a go-to beer. And this is a polar opposite from how it was when I was growing up, when the breweries in particular, speaking to them, and the same thing with whiskey, you were either Coke or Pepsi, and you figured that out when you were in college. What's your beer brand? And you stuck to it. What's your whiskey brand? And you stuck to it. That is not happening with the fans. And the distilleries are trying to figure out, okay, what do we do? And I'm not really sure too many people have an answer right now. So
Spending so much time getting new customers. You're always getting people into the trial phase and trying, but to get them to buy 5, 10, 20 bottles over the lifetime, that's a harder. Yeah.
It's a harder thing, and it's why you're seeing all of them coming out with new bottling after new bottling. Because if you don't have a new bottle, nobody is doing tastings of Wild Turkey 101.
Yeah.
Nobody is discussing that over and over again, because if you do, and you own a podcast or one of those big shows, they can literally look at their ratings and they fall off a cliff. So in other words, if they do another story about Allocated, they'll get 30,000 views. If they have me on to talk about the three-chamber rye, their viewership will fall off the cliff. So the industry is kind of doing it to itself.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how many people have figured that out yet, and I'm hoping that people, obviously like your club, get a bit more adventurous and try some of these smaller distillers, because if you can support them, they're going to have more and more old offerings. They're going to have 10s and 15s and 20s. Your old whiskey. They're going to have what it is you're looking for, which is the hard to find bottle that nobody knows about, but you adore.
A reason for existing is helping to showcase other distilleries, people you might not see, you might see them on the shelf, you might never think to get them, or people you can't find, and help get into your house. You go, that's a cool bottle.
And thank you from behalf of the other small distillers. We're lucky in that we've been around for a long time and we make other things. But if you can think about those small whiskey producers that are out there, that's all they do, the unasked for advice or plea from me is give them a chance, give them a try. See if you can find your bottle, and then, buy 4 bottles a year makes all the difference to them. So we appreciate that kind of support.
Awesome. Well, Todd, thank you so much for joining today. I hope everyone it. We'll post the video later, and thanks again.
Cheers. Bye-bye.